of controversy surrounding the Israel-Palestine conflict is contrived, it's fabricated, it's artificial. And the purpose of this contrived, fabricated controversy is to deflect attention from and sow confusion about the documentary record. That's going to be the burden of my remarks this evening. One of the artificial, contrived controversies is this dragging in of the new anti-Semitism, to which I'll refer later on. Let me, however, begin with a simple illustration of the argument I want to make tonight. Most everybody in this audience, I presume, is familiar with this phenomenon called the peace process. How many people have heard of that? The peace process. That's cool. In the right room. How many of you have heard of the peace process? Okay. I'm beginning to know that maybe I was thinking. And a subset of this phenomenon called the peace process is what's called the final status issues. How many people have heard that expression? That requires a certain level of expertise. We're now at a 200 level course. Okay. The final status issues generally means, or is said to mean, those issues of the Israel-Palestine conflict which are so controversial, so contentious, that they have to be put off to the last stage of negotiations, the final stage, the assumption being if you begin negotiations with these issues, the negotiations will immediately break down. You first need another term of the trade, you first need confidence-building measures, and then we move on to those contentious, allegedly contentious, final status issues. And those final status issues are generally said to be four. For those of you who are familiar with the subject, feel free to correct me if you feel there is any misrepresentation. Number one, the question of borders. What are the proper borders of the state of Israel, and what are the proper borders of a future Palestinian state? Number two, the question of settlements. What is the legal status of the 460,000 settlers who Israel has transferred to the West Bank, Gaza, before Gaza, and Jerusalem, East Jerusalem? Number three, the legal status of East Jerusalem. To whom, if either party, does East Jerusalem belong? And number four, the question of the Palestinian refugees, their right of return under international law. There's sometimes a fifth issue, usually water, but water has pretty much disappeared from the negotiations, so I'll leave that aside. Now, as some of you know, in July 2004, the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, was asked by the General Assembly of the United Nations to render what's called an advisory opinion on the legal status of the wall that Israel has been building in the West Bank. And the court, in order to render its opinion on the legal status of the wall, first had to answer other legal questions. By coincidence, three of the four final status issues came up in the court's deliberations for reasons which ought to be obvious to everyone in this room. The wall that Israel has been building, 80% of it is in the West Bank. Now, if the West Bank were legally Israeli territory, then the question of the legality of the wall would not arise, because Israel is building a wall within its own territory. So the court had to ask, to whom does the West Bank belong? Similarly, the wall takes what the International Court of Justice called a sinuous route, that's the fancy word for winding route, which goes around the settlements that Israel is building. So, if the settlements are legal under international law, the route of the wall raises no legal issues. Thirdly, the wall cuts right through neighborhoods of East Jerusalem. If East Jerusalem is Israeli territory, again, no legal issues arise for Israel. And so the court had to explore all of these questions first before it could decide on the legality of the wall. Well, what did the highest judicial body in the world, the International Court of Justice, decide? Number one, the question of borders. We're told sometimes in the media that the West Bank and Gaza, that these are disputed territories. Last week, the New York Times ran an article by one of their reporters in the occupied territories, Isabel Kirshner. It was entitled, "Palestinians Seek Support on Borders." And in the midst of the article, it said, quote, "The dispute over borders is long-standing and shows the difficulty of trying to fulfill the goal of reaching a deal by the end of the year." Is it a long-standing dispute? Not according to the International Court of Justice. The court states that a fundamental principle of international law is it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. Most of you in this room will be familiar with that principle because in 1990, when Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, George Bush Sr. quoted that principle verbatim. He said, under international law, it's inadmissible to acquire territory by war. For those of you who have read the main United Nations Security Council resolution on the Israel-Arab conflict, Security Council Resolution 242, it says right at the head of the resolution, emphasizing the inadmissibility of the acquisition of territory by war. Well, how did Israel acquire the West Bank and Gaza? As everyone in this room knows, in June 1967, they acquired it in the course of a war. Thus, the court concludes, Israel has no title at all to any of the West Bank or Gaza. Those are not disputed territories. There is no long-standing dispute over the status of those territories. The court is emphatic on this point. You'll see throughout their advisory opinion, they refer to the West Bank and Gaza as, quote, occupied